everybody, and welcome to Edel and Sapphic Storytime. I'm excited to have you with me here today as I highlight my new September 23rd release, War and Solace. So, it's in the editing process. I've been hearing back from some of my beta readers, and one thing has come up. There are some terms and words and references in there that a few readers who are not always into Viking historical romances aren't necessarily familiar with. So I thought I'd put together a quick little slideshow where I could kind of explain some of those background information that might make the book a little more enjoyable, a little less confusing to people who read it. Now, this is not technical. In fact, I'm hoping you will find it quite entertaining. So if you will, I am going to just switch the screens here. It's going to take just a minute for this to start up, and hopefully you will be having a title page come on. The World of Norvegr, background knowledge for the Tales from Norvegr series. We are going to learn a little bit about Vikings, and it's not going to be what you expect, I suspect. Anyway, first of all, Norvegr, where on earth is this place? You say it's historical fiction and not a fantasy. Well, Norvegr is simply the ancient word for what is today the country of Norway. And it was not a united country back in the 7th and 8th centuries. It was a whole bunch of little kingdoms, and they would change from time to time. But some of the major kingdoms that are in my stories are indicated on this map here. And there's a little early medieval map. A fylke was a name for a kingdom, or a fylke was like a fief in medieval Europe. It was like a county, some sort of subdivision within the kingdom. And the landscapes are breathtaking. There are mountains and fjords. There are rivers and lakes, snow-capped peaks and grassy meadows. There's a lot of gently sloping, a lot of timber, beautiful, gorgeous, gorgeous country. And also, I need to mention about the midnight sun and then also the long dark. Because of being so close to the North Pole, when the sun is directly overhead in the summertime, it almost never gets dark. And likewise, there's a period of time during the winter where it almost never gets light. Viking villages, like those in most parts of the world, were typically built along bodies of water. And this is an artist's representation of a Viking village here. And here's another one where we can see the thatch and a little bit of the sod on the roofs of the peaked roofs of the houses. This one shows a good bit of sod, and of course sod was a good insulator for the house to keep it both cool in the summer and warm in the winter. And also they liked to decorate their houses with these carved wood beams and different decor. And once again by the water here. This is how you might typically think of seeing a Viking warrior, with the chainmail armor and wearing a helmet with the weapons and shield. Now, I do want to point out, that's Piper in the background, by the way. If you haven't met Piper yet, she is adorable. Stay tuned, and we'll be sure to have some videos of her doing cuteness things. So they did not have horns on their helmets. That was some sort of Bugs Bunny thing that got translated into modern culture, but Vikings had nose guards, cheek guards, but no horns on their helmets. Also, the metal was very expensive, so only rich warriors would have a helmet or even chainmail armor or metal bracers like this guy. And then, of course, this gal over here. The spear and the axe were typical weapons because they had less metal and therefore were more affordable. Swords, once again, pretty much for the wealthy. We know they had all of these metal weapons because of the artifacts that have been found, including the chainmail, which was extremely expensive because somebody had to put that together by hand out of little tiny strings of metal, usually iron or steel. This is more typically what a Viking warrior would look like, wearing a padded gamison, which was kind of like a tunic with a little extra padding for incidental swipes, offered some protection. He's got a long-handled axe there, a sea axe or a long knife, and then he also has his sword and his round shield. The shields, called rons, were typically made of wood with metal edging around the edge and a metal centerpiece holding it all together in the center. Here is a king's sword, or possibly a jarl's sword, which has been turned into a work of art with all of the fine etching and artistic decoration that went on it. Now, women in Viking society were extremely important. They outnumbered the men, and they did all kinds of things. They were free to engage in different types of trade and crafts and occupations, but primarily their role was as wives and mothers. Their outfits included an underdress with usually some sort of an apron or overdress over the top of it, often held together by these brooches that acted like pins to hold up the apron. The children here have toys. They had carved animals, dolls, tops, balls, puzzles, toy weapons, all kinds of things for the children to play with. And they also had pets. Vikings typically kept dogs, sometimes cats, and occasionally wild animals like wolves and bears as pets. And we know this because some laws survived talking about the responsibilities if you owned a bear or a wolf as a pet, and that you had to keep it confined, and if it was out roaming about the village, people were free to kill it because it was scary to them. And if their wild bear, if their pet bear did damage, they would have to pay for it, and so forth. This woman's holding a horn. The drinking horn was a typical piece of Viking accessories that they would take traveling as a drinking cup. They also had regular cups made out of wood and metal, but this was kind of a uniquely Viking thing. It was easy to carry with you on a trip. Just slide it into your belt and there you go. Viking society was not an absolute monarchy. They had a legislative body called the Thing that would meet in the village whenever the Jarl called for a meeting, or perhaps a regularly scheduled one once or twice, or however many times a year. Then there would be the All Thing, where people from all over the whole kingdom could come to the capital to meet to vote on things. And all free men were allowed a vote at the Thing. They also served as a jury for important trials. Now, there were kings, and under the king were the jarls, and that is the exact word as the English word earl, and they were the primary nobility. But the king could only do so much. He had to have the consent and support of the jarls because they had their own armies, they had their own wealth and their own land. So, in order for the king to really accomplish anything, he had to have the jarls on board. Other important persons in society were the vulva. She was the seer, the performer of magic, the person with the ear of the gods. They were almost always women, and they would make prophecies and predictions and give wise advice to people who came and asked of them. The gradari, the healer, a very skilled person within the society who learned all about the various herbs and treatments and was depended upon to get people well and over their injuries. And they used herbal medicine. They also would do wound tending, set broken bones, and sometimes even perform crude surgeries. We do know from a recipe that had been preserved of a particular ointment for wound treatment that they had. Some Dr. Science people reproduced this according to the recipe and found that it cures staph infection better than any antibiotics on the market today. So they did have some effective healing treatments. They didn't just slap a leech on you. The Gothi was like the priest, and the Gothis would perform sacrifices and rites and rituals. The Gothis also could read the runes. And even though Vikings did not have a written language, they had a hieroglyphic type symbols that represented various gods or words, and they would carve them onto pieces of stone or ivory or wooden squares, and the Gothi would read the runes and tell what the gods were saying through the runes to the people. Then there was the law speaker, and the law speaker was kind of a cross between a historian and a lawyer, because they didn't have the written language. There were no law books to refer to, and so the laws had to be memorized and passed down from one law speaker to the next. And not only would they memorize all of the details of the laws and anything that was new that a king added in or anything that was taken out that a king took out, but they also would have the precedents of former cases where the same, so that the king would know what sentence had been handed down for this offense in the past. So they were a very important people. And these four professions were not necessarily indicative of being a noble class person, but whether they had a lot of money or only little money, these people were all very revered by the members of society. Then there were non-warrior occupations. We get this idea that all Vikings were just raiders and off to war, chopping up folks all day long, all the time, but that was not exactly the case. Farmers and herders were the backbone of society, just like they are in any society, because everyone had to eat. Shipbuilders, they had the best ships in the world at that time period. Timber cutters and carpenters, fishers and hunters, craftsmen of all varieties. Entertainers. You may be familiar with the bard, the medieval bard. Well, the Vikings had skalds, which were basically the same thing. They would be the storytellers and recite epic poems. Then there were musicians, the professional musicians who might be hired by the king to perform in his hall every night. Then there were traveling musicians who would be in a band of entertainers that went from one place to another, kind of like medieval troubadours. And then the guy who could play an instrument and would get together with his friends at the local mead hall or ale house and entertain the customers for a free beer. Merchants were very important. Trade was important in Viking society, and they had points on the Amber Road and the Silk Road, which were important trading routes at that time period. The lowest members of society would be the thralls, who were slaves, and these slaves were usually enemy captives that Vikings took when they won a war with somebody, and they were not at all like the institution of slavery in North American history. All of these slaves were white, because everybody who lived up there pretty much was white. They didn't have the, it was just different. But thralls could gain their freedom if they, if their owners decided to give it to them, but they could also be sold or traded or given away as a gift. Because they were legally property. Most thralls served as domestic servants, although there were also thralls who were agricultural workers as well. Were there real Viking warrior women? Archaeology says yes. Graves of women have been found buried with weapons and armor, and one particular one. And when this was first found, they were sure, oh, this was a man. This was a king's grave, because there was this huge Viking ship that had been buried. And it had treasure chests full of treasure and all kinds of weapons and armor and horses and everything that had been buried with this person of great power and wealth. And recently, it was like 2018, 2019 or so, they did a DNA test and much more scrutiny of the skeleton, and discovered that it was a woman's skeleton, not a man's, and she might have been a queen, or at least a very important jarl, and possibly even a warrior queen. Epic sagas say yes, women fighters have been featured in many of the stories that were told and passed down through oral tradition, not just of goddesses, but of women heroes and their exploits and what they did and accomplished. Art and artifacts say yes. There have been found all these carved figures of women dressed for battle, with their helmets and their swords and their shields and their armor. And 100 years ago, archaeologists said, oh, well, these just depict the Valkyrs. They aren't meant to in any way indicate that women were real warriors. But today, many anthropologists, archaeologists, and historians believe that these figures could indeed have represented female warriors. Women defended their homes when men were away. They didn't have a whole lot of choice. Everyone in Viking society was taught to use weapons. Men were away quite often. But most women kept to conventional roles as wives and mothers. Here's another picture of a Viking warrior woman. They were called shield maidens. And the shield maiden's job in the army was pretty much just to be an alternate or a substitute when a male warrior was injured or killed. She would fill in his spot in the shield wall to keep it from breaking. But if you've ever followed the TV series Vikings, you may be familiar with Lagertha, who was indeed a fabulous warrior in her own right. Women and the law. Men typically dominated society. However, women had more rights in Norse society than in other parts of the world during the Middle Ages. For example, they had the right to own property, the right to divorce their husbands, the right to choose a career, and they could become a warrior, jarl, or queen if they met the qualifications. Laws also were made to protect women. Both rape and sexual harassment of free female citizens was against the law and could result in a fine, corporal punishment, banishment, or being challenged to a holmgang, which was a duel. Just like the rest of medieval Europe in Viking society, judging by combat was quite often done. And it was believed that the gods would give the victory to the party who was in the right, and the party who was in the wrong would lose. And the duel did not have to be to the death. Often it was to the death, but it could be to who was disarmed first or who drew blood first. And in their society, it was okay to kill somebody as long as it was done in a fair fight with witnesses. However, murder performed in secret, in which the person does not come forward and admit to what he had done and give an explanation to the jarl or the king, that was very bad, because things that people did in secret and tried to get away with and be sneaky about were punished very severely. Things like stealing and oath breaking were severe crimes, because all these folks depended on each other to keep their word in order to survive. And someone who steals, someone who does not keep their word, those people would be eliminated from society. Sex in the Viking world was quite different than sex in medieval Europe or even any other time period in history before today, really. Consenting adults, which would be from past puberty and up, were expected to have sex. Now, they didn't have teenagers in society the way we did. You were a child, and then you were an adult, and usually somewhere around 14 or 15 years of age, they kind of transitioned from childhood to adulthood. Sex between women or three-ways were not considered abnormal. However, male-male relationships were condemned by men in the society. And one of the reasons for that is because about the worst thing that a man could be, or be accused of, or appear to be, was effeminate. You had to be a manly man, a strong man, a very virile, macho man, or else you would be severely ridiculed, ostracized, and sometimes abused or run out of town. So it was a lot trickier for two men who fell in love than it was for two women, which was not really frowned upon at all. However, it was unusual for a woman not to marry a man at least once. Marriages could be open if both parties agreed to it. It depends on what you included in your vows. But they could divorce each other over infidelity. Polygamy was legal, but rare. There were more women in society than men. As we mentioned, the men kill each other off. However, a man would have to be able to afford two wives, and they really didn't like putting up with the bickering that might be involved in having two women sharing the same house. Viking values industriousness. You needed to be productive. Hospitality was extremely important in their society. You were expected to welcome a traveler or a visitor into your home and give them a place to stay and provide them a meal. That was expected. Discipline, extremely important for discipline. Honor, truth, courage, fidelity, being a person of integrity was the cornerstone of the society. Self-reliance, you don't want to have to depend on everybody else to take care of you. And perseverance, a Viking never gives up. What is our mythology were Norse beliefs at the time. And Yggdrasil, the life tree, is where all of the 9 kingdoms branched off from. And I find it interesting that most cultures and religions around the world have some sort of a tree of life in their mythos. It's quite interesting when you start comparing different belief systems around the world, how many things they have in common. And this tree of life is one of them. In this, oops, I didn't mean to do that. Oh, well, I apologize. There were, I wonder if I can get back. Yes, I got back to it. Yay! Okay, there was places for the elves and the dwarves and the giants in Jotunheim. Asgard and Vanaheim were the 2 realms of the gods. They had 2 camps of gods, so to speak. Midgard was where the humans lived. And then down here at the bottom were all the not-so-nice places, including Helheim, which really seems like a model for the medieval interpretation of Christian hell. The primary gods. Odin, the All-Father, was the chief god, who values wisdom, gave up his eye, and hung on a tree for 9 days to gain great wisdom. He oversees Valhalla, can come down to Midgard in disguise and walk among humans, which he might do in order to test someone's sense of hospitality, to see if they would welcome him and give him a hot meal. Freya, the chief goddess of the Vanir, love and beauty, but also has powerful magic. She oversees the other admirable afterlife realm, the other god's camp. Frigg, Odin's wife, goddess of love, beauty, and fertility. Some sources say that Frigg and Freya are different names for the same entity, but in my books they are 2 different goddesses. Tyr, god of war and courage. He put his hand in the great wolf Fenrir's mouth and lost it in order to save all the worlds from the ferocious wolf. Thor, god of thunder, probably the most recognizable one because of Marvel Comics, uses his magic hammer to keep the giants at bay. And then Loki, the trickster. Valhalla is Odin's hall for slain warriors. Valkyries were some sort of, not exactly goddesses, but not humans either, some sort of in-between type being who would ride their flying horses down to retrieve fallen warriors and take them to Valhalla. Also, the road to Asgard that went from Midgard to the land of the gods was a rainbow bridge. So if you ever wondered where they came up with the rainbow bridge for pets, it is from the Norse mythology, the rainbow bridge that connected our realm to heaven. And you can find all of the Tales from Norvegr at Amazon, your country's store. There is Sigurd and Elin, a warrior, enemies to lovers, action romance. Legacy of the Valiant, a hero's journey, action romance. War and Solace, a nurse back to health, opposites attract, action romance. Please visit my website. It's easy to remember, www.author.edellane.com. And click the subscribe button below so you can subscribe to my YouTube channel and never miss one of our shows. We're back again. I hope you enjoyed my little romp through history as we learned a little bit more about Vikings, and hopefully I have whetted your appetite for War and Solace, which next time I will be reading a short passage from. So be sure and tune back in to find out more about our heroes, Tyrdes and Adele, the battle-hardened shield maiden, and the pacifist healer. Thank you for being with me today, and be sure and click that subscribe button, and I'll see you on the flip side.